Hi, welcome to the Y Arts podcast. I have heard so much about all your work, and I'm so excited and honored to have you on this podcast. Before we start, let's start with introductions. Could you share more about you?
Hi, Nanvi. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you on this. So I have, I don't know, to start back at the beginning, um, besides being an atelierista, I have trained in pre-primary, so early years, and junior primary, which is your foundation phase education. I am the daughter of one of the co-founders of the Africa Reggio Emilia Alliance, Tessa Browne's daughter. And I have been an atelierista. This is my seventh year of being in a Reggio-inspired school as the atelierista and a presenter for the Africa Reggio Media Alliance, as well as running their social media.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, before we start, let's start from a bit of beginning. What was your oldest memory when you felt creative or something, when you thought of using arts as a way of expression? So, just to kind of open up of what was your first memory of being into this space?
Okay, so I think to give you a bit of scaffold of who we are as a family, particularly,
Hmm.
my gran was an artist and playwright by profession. And even from my youngest years, I can remember my mother pushing creativity, art, anything expressive throughout our childhood. And my mother studied education when I was 9, I think, when she qualified. And the one thing that really stood out for me, which I think has had quite a profound effect on the way I teach, is she used to confiscate any coloring in books that we were given as children. And at first, I didn't understand it. And then she would say, I want you to draw your own pictures because I believe in your drawings, not somebody else telling you what it should look like. And then you color in your own space. And I didn't realize what impact that would have on me until I studied education for myself. So when I went into studying education, I immediately wanted arts as a background. Um, it's part of the major that I you kind of studied when I was studying, and I've tried to always bring that creative, expressive side within my teaching, no matter what phase of education I was teaching. And I think, I can't not share this part because it's so much part of who we are. But in 2008, my mother was the first teacher in South Africa to go to Reggio Emilia. She was heading up the preschool at St. Mary's in Johannesburg, and she just, people were looking to try and sell her books with coloring in worksheets for preschoolers, and she just knew without a doubt that that was not what is in the best interests of children. And so she decided to go in and study some more, kind of do some research, and she was pointed in the direction of the schools in Reggio Emilia. And that's when she applied for a visitorship award and was given that by, we have an Independent Schools of Southern Africa association, and they gave her this award. And together with her boss, Des Hugo, they went to Reggio Emilia, and saw they participated in the Reggio Children International Study Group, and Carla Rinaldi's um, the first presentation she did about it was entitled "All Children Are Intelligent: A Truth, an Aspiration, a Commitment." And when they went out for dinner that night, they determined in their minds that this was an approach that they desperately needed to bring to South Africa. So coming back to South Africa, we were in a state of moving home, and we were going to eventually move to my parents. And my children were young, and I started to see how my mother wanted to bring the approach back to South Africa, and she started to work with particularly my daughter, who was 3 in 2008, and then when we officially moved here in 2010, she was 5. And that aha moment for me about the Reggio approach was finding my mother down the passage on the floor on her tummy, lying next to Abigail, and there was this beautiful moth on the wall with a magnifying glass, and there was this engagement, this deep questioning. And tell me, Abigail, what do you see? What do you notice? That kind of scaffold. And they spent a good part of the afternoon just engaging in that space. And then my mother invited Abigail to draw.
Hmm.
And what I saw was this anatomically correct, you know, butterfly. And I was like, oh my goodness, just so struck by that. And then my mum continued that kind of research with Abigail when she was outside. Like, we have a swimming pool, and she'd wanted to swim. And I was often at work or whatever, and my mother said, okay, if you're going to swim, then you need to understand I will watch you to make sure you're safe, but then I ask you that you engage in the research that I'm doing. And she was very happy to do so. So they would in the pool, round the garden, all of that. And it really started to strike me as something that was really worth looking at and researching, um, and taking note of, because she used that research not only in sharing at her school, when she was speaking to the parents about creativity and how children develop their own schema, but also then with the workshops with the Africa Reggio Emilia Alliance. So that's kind of where that was my big aha moment.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing kind of like how it all started with like questions and like small kind of interests and looking with children, like one child, and then kind of developing into it. And I'm curious because a lot of people are not fully aware of what an atelierista is and what does it mean to work in like arts space. So I would love if you could share more about like what led you, like you shared like your before journey, but I would love to talk if you could talk more about like who as an atelierista and why arts is such an integral part when you're working with children and about 100 languages also. So we can start by sharing more about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, for those who aren't aware, in the 1970s, Loris Malaguzzi, the founding father of the Reggio Emilia approach, introduced the role of the atelierista and the atelier into the educational project to create a different lens on education, um, to come alongside not only children but teachers and families to really provoke that thinking. And part of the beauty of the Reggio Emilia approach is he wrote this poetic declaration, the 100 languages, which speaks of 100 possibilities of children from birth to 99. And arts forms so much part of the 100 languages, the language of paint, the language of drawing, the language of clay, wire. Arts doesn't just have to be in a traditional sense. The arts extends not just to your visual arts. There's the dramatic arts, there's, music, there's all of those wonderful things that come into play as well.
Yeah.
So when, as an atelierista, what I come alongside the children and provide as many possibilities within an atelier space for engagement in the 100 languages to help them, well, to give them opportunities to engage in research and to to understand the world around them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm curious, like, what has been your moments where you saw with working with children, if you have any anecdotes which you saw, like how arts kind of shifted something in children, something learning, which might like words might have not been able to formulate for the children, but something when you saw like these like expressing ideas, which was like really like stuck with you, especially like looking at like how arts was a way as a medium for them to express something.
Okay, so one one of the languages that I think is absolutely essential
Hmm.
is the graphic language, the drawing, the pleasure of drawing, as Loris Malaguzzi spoke about. because it formulates an idea, it formulates a blueprint. And where I've seen that happen quite extensively is when the children come into my atelier their atelier, sorry, when they come into the atelier, we've got a circle of democracy where they come in, they're welcomed, and we revisit documentation from the previous lessons, and we chat through things, and we kind of relaunch where things have been and where they're going. And often we will be speaking about things, and then the ideas start to formulate as they develop their own theories, bouncing off each other's ideas. And I offer the children the graphic language whenever. It's always available. I may not tell them it's here, but it will be easily accessible for them, as well as the children having the agency to go and find other mark makers, other mark receivers. If they want to engage in paint, they can do so. So that they have as many opportunities as possible. Um, it's so important to have that art aspect within it, but also to differentiate between this traditional art teacher
Hmm.
as opposed to an atelierista. There's a very big difference.
Yeah, could you share more about it? Because I think that's a very interesting point. And if you have any example of like projects or something of this integration which has happens with atelierista and in comparison to art teachers, because I think that's a very big kind of a topic also.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I think traditionally people find that when you talk about the atelier, they immediately go to this art teacher. Um, and my own children who are grown will tell you that I'm a glorified art teacher to tease me. But in being an atelierista, you are providing as many as possible kind of avenues, the 100 languages, for the children to express themselves. So it could be through, um, for instance, working with light, working with shadow, working with, something more scientific or mathematical. Um, so to to keep it just to saying an art teacher, this is how you will do art, is very prescriptive.
Mm.
Whereas an atelierista, you're coming alongside the children and the children are leading you in. Um, so to give you an example, what it'll lead into my digital landscapes. I'm sure you're going to pick up on why that happened. I started to notice. So my first atelier was called the Everywhere Atelier. That came out of COVID because when I started at Reddam, where I teach, Reddam House Waterfall Early Learning School, it was 2020, and that was COVID here. And we started, and I was super excited, and then everything shut down. And we had to come back and do hybrid. And I had quite a small space as an atelier. And I was nervous. I think a lot of people worldwide were. Of keeping safe for the children and for myself and for my own family. So I decided to offer the opportunity of being outside with the children. So we spent a lot of time sitting outside the atelier, going out into the wider school community, into our wetlands. Um, just before COVID, we had planted a speckworm garden, so we spent time in there. So there were a lot of other opportunities, and out of that emerged this Everywhere Atelier. And it really struck a chord with me because Loris Malaguzzi spoke about beyond the beyond. And, it's so important for the culture of the atelier, this mindset to permeate within a school. It's, not just confined to the four walls of an atelier or a classroom. That thinking needs to go right through the school. And then, I started to engage in more research because I started to see how the children were very drawn to light,
Mm.
the projector, the shadows, reflections, rainbows, all of those kind of things. And I really wanted to delve deeper into that space. So fortunately, I've been to Reggio Emilia twice. I'm very grateful to have gone to the Reggio Children International Study Group and engaged in quite extensive research. The second time I went, I spent time with Marcus Fajari. Christian Fabi organized for me to spend a bit of time with him, trying to understand some more stuff about the different ateliers. And he was very gracious and took me into the ateliers and scaffolded my thinking over and above the study group. And I was quite taken with the digital landscapes because it really spoke to a deeper kind of light atelier. And I just thought about the children in my space. And I was like, okay, I want to create the opportunity for the children to engage in that kind of research because they were already starting to do that.
Yeah.
And the child that really sparked that desire for me to understand more, he was 5 and what I noticed, there was a mirror, an angled mirror next to the projector. There was a Swarovski crystal, those crystals that make beautiful rainbows,
Yeah.
just also there. And there was a plastic block that had been a building block that was there that he had put across. Um, and next to our projector, we've got a light that's got a magnifying glass in the middle of the light. And I started to notice how this child was starting to assemble all of these things. And I was quite curious. So I stood back to watch and see. And the child started to speak aloud and not to anybody, but to themselves. And like, oh, I'm building a digital microscope and, working with that. And what had happened, just to give you a bit of scaffold, is the week before I'd exposed them to a digital microscope.
Mm.
And here this child was now trying to create a digital microscope. So I invited the child to draw their thinking. And immediately, of course, and the drawing was so scientific. I was quite, kind of almost taken aback because I was just, wow, this is a 5-year-old. And the way that the digital microscope that had been, the way the child had put everything with a mirror and
Yeah.
then the Swarovski crystal, then this little box around it, and then this magnifying glass on top, it worked.
Yeah.
And I think that's what made me realize that it's more than just art.
Mm.
It's that whole expression.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. I love that you share that also because it also makes me think about like how arts has always seen as like an outcome, but this integration of like artful thinking and like these different kinds of
Yes.
thinking which are emerging through doing a project, through these exploration is so important. And I'm curious like what kind of like your research has led into like this world of like how graphic lines have kind of supported children to kind of think through their ideas, to also represent that ideas, and like how in your like ateliers like arts has played this language of integrating and like going beyond, like it's not just like one atelier that you come, but it's also kind of connected to what they're learning in different classrooms, they're learning outside in the world, and kind of bringing all of it together and building onto this inquiry. Like I would love if you could talk also more about that.
Okay. So like what I try to do, particularly, I don't know if I understand the question right, but
Yeah.
I will just speak to
Mm.
so if a child, for instance, has represented something graphically, um, we don't just stop there. We often the children leave their artifacts in the atelier, not because I would like them to, but because there's that sense of belonging. They feel like when they leave their mark in the atelier, whether it's the Everywhere Atelier, the Digital Landscapes, whether, they have a piece of themselves there. Um, I will, as part of setting up for possibilities, maybe put the things out that they have been working on with an extra provocation. So maybe some wire next to it, or the clay out, or so that the child takes, because they are curious, as you know, children are so curious. And when you set it up in a way that inquiry draws the children in, they really they want to engage and take it further. I mean, I've had children take their drawings and then go into our treasure trove, which is our Remedia-inspired little creative recycling hub, and go and find whatever they want and create the most um, kind of detailed uh, expression, and transferring what they've done, for instance, on a 2D format into a 3D format. It's quite incredible to just watch that happen.
Yeah. I think like just building onto it, which is awesome. If you could also share, because it also makes me question about like how people don't say these are very like cognitive development, executive functioning things which are happening when children are exploring these materials, these arts, or like just material in different like forms. And I'm curious, like what kind of things, because there's often I've heard from people is like, oh, what are they actually learning, right? Like, are they actually learning, like it's not kind of labeled into like science, math, like so environment studies, social studies, whatever, like different subjects which you call quote unquote in normal schools. So I'm curious, like what kind of like, how do you like share this with people who might not have been into a Reggio experiences, and like talking more about like how these are like very intentional cognitive development which is happening early on, and it is impacted to their all the parts of their lives too.
Absolutely. So, you know what, I think as an atelierista, it's so important that you are aware of the curriculum, obviously, because I mean, we know the curriculum is something that is there, but it's about reimagining those spaces. So when planning for possibilities, there's always the things like fine motor, gross motor, crossing the midline, counting. I mean, it all, it's an immersive and emergent curriculum. And I understand that some people find that difficult to look for the learning. Um, but it is, if you step back, like Loris Malguzzi said, stand back, leave room for learning. And say, for instance, you've got a teacher who comes in with these developmental milestones or indicators that they want to cover for their outcomes. If they took time to watch and observe, they would start to see that those things are already happening within in an atelier and art, even in the playground.
Yeah.
Um, and it's spontaneous. They are responsive, and so I think it's about keeping an open mindset. But I understand that it's difficult for teachers, and so what I do with documentation in our atelier is I prepare a PDF document that gets shared with not only with the teachers but with the families every 2 weeks of that class particularly, and we track their thinking, we track their voices are captured, all of that, so that when it gets emailed out, the families have an opportunity to revisit it with the children on their own laptops at home. um, and the teachers have an opportunity to see what is happening in the atelier, and does it is there something in the atelier that's happening that is happening in their own spaces. So that's kind of how I've been doing it. um, and also the other way we do it is in my presentations for the Africa Reggio Media Alliance. There we've got a core presenting team, and we have the opportunity, once the course my mother covers the theory, we have the opportunity to share documentation on the specific principles that we're covering that night. And I use material from the spaces in the atelier to try and make it visible to other educators. Our main focus is underserved and under-resourced early years settings. And when we do those in-person workshops, there's a practical element. Um, you know, there will always be something to kind of highlight the principle that we're working with. So, for instance, working with clay or working with setup, working with organization, but then also getting the teachers, when they come back to the next session, to bring in something from their space so that it becomes a space of reflection in their own teaching. And we look for the possibilities. And because I think people are nervous to begin.
Mm.
So if we can be that scaffold to encourage them, it really does help.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I'm curious, like what kind of I'm like kind of going back to like any conversations with the teachers or with the children, like when teachers come back is like, oh my God, like I saw this big shift in my children, or any conversation which kind of stuck with you is like why, like the power of arts and the power of using these like ateliers, using Reggio as a pedagogy is so like powerful, especially for teachers, who are new to this and they kind of explode it as you were scaffolding with them, or like children, like either of them.
Yeah. So, if I think back,
Yeah.
um, we if you look at our platform, the Africa Reggio Media Alliance platform, there's one particular um, workshop that we did in Vosloorus, where it's a smaller community that's fairly underserved, but there's this great need and desire to really come alongside children. And these teachers started to bring in drawings. And, they'd spent 4 weeks with us doing workshops and that. And then at the end, they brought these drawings and displayed what they'd noticed because they'd been collecting drawings over that time. Of once they were, because they were also trying to implement what they were learning in their classrooms. And just seeing how these teachers, even their demeanor, their poise, their belief in themselves, first of all, was so different. Suddenly you could see there was like, oh wow, this is what I'm noticing in the children, or I've seen this, and this is what this child said. Yes, it might not have been as deep as one who's been journeying with the approach for so many years, but you could see that something had shifted. Regardless of where you are as an atelierista, I think mindset change for all teachers is difficult, particularly when you have been taught in a certain way your own self. We often refer back to the way we were taught, and I think it's about reimagining education for a future that. I mean, that's why the Reggio Emilia approach came about, because they didn't want the children to suffer the atrocities that they had suffered. Um, so I think one of the well, I know one of the pivotal ways that makes it more visible is if I'm, for instance, presenting to our staff, for instance, and I'm showcasing some of the documentation that's happening within the space with the children. I will visually put it up and then talk to those developmental indicators or outcomes and say, what do you see first of all? Because I want the teachers not to just sit back. I want them to engage in that space and look for the learning, look for those kind of things, and say, but have you looked closer? If you watch this video, do you see that there's incidental text? Or do you see how the child is counting without you saying a word? The child is, while they're drawing 1, 2, 3, and then there's that social constructivism happening, because you might have a child who may not be engaging but is watching, and just highlighting that this is all learning that is happening right in front of you. um, it's just about reimagining, standing back, shifting your mindset and your heart set, because it's also about it's very much a person thing. Um, but it's also being open to the imagination. It's about also not stopping the inquiry, let's put it that way,
Yeah.
because often people find it easier to just give a child an answer because they think, oh, it's fine, let's move on. But I remember the second Reggio Children International Study Group I attended, Christian Fabi spoke about the Reggio approach being a slow pedagogy, almost like that simmering in a pan. And it's not going to happen like that. It's about learning to slow down for that learning to really go deeper. And that's why, like, even in my atelier, I have slowed the atelier time down as much as possible. So before, when I first started at Reddam, I would have a full class at a time, which was very intense. Yes, I would have a teaching assistant with them, but that was like 23 children. And now what we've done with my timetable is we've made it so that I've got maybe 12, and sometimes we split it even further to 5 or 6, so that you've got that inquiry time and being alongside the children in a deeper way. Um, and I think, I know you know about Reggio Nara. I'm not sure how many other people know about Reggio Nara, but Reggio Nara is that storytelling weekend that Reggio Emilia has, where the impossible's made possible. Let's put it that way. Um, and we, as the Africa Reggio Emilia Alliance, have also we've got Africanara. Christian Fabi made a suggestion in 2023 to the alliance. Why don't you do an Africanara? And they launched it as a place of possibility of really reigniting the language of storytelling, of imagination, reading, all of that love, because our literacy levels in South Africa particularly are very low. Um, and I think, I mean, I'm not sure if you know, but in Reggio Emilia, they employed a municipal puppeteer at the beginning. And I mean, what city does that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, you made so many like great points in this conversation, and I was just thinking also about I love a couple of things. Like the first, also the idea of like the documentation on the walls and how like I've often seen in classrooms they will present the outcome, like the end. Okay, like
Yeah,
this is what the child
yeah,
created, but then we don't kind of honor the thinking. Like oh, like like the outcome just didn't come up. It was like a question, and then they did the whole process and journey, and I think it's so
yes,
important to put that process also in highlight, because I feel like that's the
yeah,
challenge with arts is also is like we are always looking at the outcome. We forget like what were the thinking, and like kind of making that visible for the child too is like it's honoring, because sometimes then they kind of compare on just the outcome of the things, and we forget of the rich conversations which happen to reach the outcome. So I love that idea also, and also like the whole idea of storytelling. Like I am a big believer of like storytelling and like literacy kind of emerging and not kind of teaching them like what is A, B, C, D, but kind of going
yeah.
through this expression of learning literacy so that they actually enjoy it. Yeah, you have.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important not to focus on the product. And I think that's the difference between an art teacher and an atelierista. An art teacher wants the product,
Yeah,
and the atelierista, it's about the process. And the thinking is beautiful in itself.
exactly.
And what does emerge with the children engaging in deeper research and all of that, the product does emerge,
Yeah.
but it's not the focus.
No. Yeah, I'm curious, and now kind of going towards like the summarizing part is like also I'm curious, like what do you think are the challenges with this approach to making it accessible? Because I've heard also a lot of time people think like, oh, like Reggio is so like expensive and it's difficult for us to bring it. So I'm curious, like what has been your conversation? Because I'm sure like we all have this conversation of like access to Reggio as a pedagogy and like how much it is so much about flexibility. So I'm curious, like to if you could share more about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know what I think? you have to be okay. First of all, your mind needs to be open and
Yeah.
to the possibilities of what it can be. So, one of the other things that I speak quite extensively about is how this is easy to begin. It doesn't take massive resource. Yes, okay, we do see a lot of Reggio inspired schools or ateliers, particularly in social media, where they are well resourced.
Yeah.
Okay. But it does not mean it cannot happen in an underprivileged space
Yeah.
or under a tree in Africa, because there are universal inquiries like light, shadow, reflection, all sorts of things. We've got some wonderful recyclables
Yeah.
that, I mean, we all everyday use that we could think about reimagining or
Right.
presenting it in a different way for children to engage with. That's not going to cost us anything and actually is sustainable in the end, because you're repurposing something that
Yeah.
you would have normally just thrown away. Um, so, I do understand that there are some financial constraints that people feel, but as I said to you, it's about reimagining that space. We've got research projects where we have a research project with a community of reclaimers, and what they're doing in their space is absolutely profound, because they've got the scaffold and the support and the mentorship. Um, and yes, they've got it's not all easy. But the one thing with the Reggio Emilia approach, and I'm sure you agree with me, is that it takes work. To be a Reggio inspired teacher, atelierista, you work hard
Yeah. Yeah. 100.
because you have to also learn to stand back and let the children lead.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's very difficult sometimes, right? Because as a teacher, we have always kind of grown up to be like, oh, you have to be giving knowledge, you know? And it's so
Yeah,
much about like hierarchy as like, when you grow up, it's like, oh, as a teacher, I'm responsible to be kind of making our child learn and giving them knowledge. But it's so
absolutely.
much not that, but so much about like a collaboration between the educators and the children, and like we work together. And I really feel like I think teachers, if they kind of get that pressure out of them, of like giving and kind of being more invested in the collaboration, the play, the just thinking of learning
Yeah.
together, I think that would be like awesome. But obviously, like, it's like you're right, like it's a time taking thing, it takes time. And
Yeah.
now to kind of summarize this conversation, also, I would love to like know, like, what do you think, like, like quote unquote children might lose out on if they are not do if they do not have access growing up to like materials, to like arts, and like kind of these early experiences which kind of nurture their later years as well.
Absolutely. I think it would be a really sad day, first of all, because that aspect of education brings such a richness, brings a space of joy. Um, if you were just to sit there and just be sitting at a desk all day, made to do, learn, wrote things all day, where's the joy?
Yeah.
Where's that really coming to grips with something? I think the arts really bring a very beautiful space into education. And yeah, I would hate to think of a future like that for the children.
Yeah.
I really do believe that our children, we don't know what the future holds for them.
Yeah.
Um, we don't know what the possibilities of work when they're older. Um, but if we can provide a space and a scaffold where children can think creatively and critically, um, it gives them a really good footing for the future.
Yeah. I agree. I love that. And I'm curious just because you shared about last thing about like your daughter and like how she grew up with this like more Reggio experience, and now she's kind of older. Like I think she's 12 now. No. What?
No, no. So she's 21.
Oh, she's 21. Sorry. So I think what
Yes.
what was for her, like I'm curious, like to kind of grow into this experience also like in older years, because she might have to go to different schools, different settings. So like what was that like she kind of kept going back to from the Reggio experiences? And I'm just very curious because I'm always curious for folks who started off, but then in like middle and high school you have to kind of go into a more traditional settings. So has that looked like for her?
Absolutely, that's a really good question, and I think you will be quite intrigued by the answer. So obviously, as the Alliance, we've been also been looking to see how children who've been exposed to the approach, yeah, at a young age, where they are, what do they do when they're in high school, what do they do
Yeah.
going forward, and some of the hallmarks that we are seeing is that they are self-starters, they're activists, they get on, they think creatively, they're problem solvers. And I really noticed that within my daughter. She is very strong, to the point where now she is studying law. She wants to be an environmental lawyer because she says nobody is standing up for the rights of the earth. So she wants to, because the environment is the third teacher.
Yeah.
And she's also doing sign language to provide voice for those who do not have a voice. So what I have noticed in her is that she really has come alongside people who may be struggling through her life. She she fights for the rights of people, and is unafraid to say, actually, I disagree with you. And I really do believe it's because the approach has given her the tools.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because that's the often my question is like, like people don't take early childhood like very seriously, and they're like always kind of putting resources in high school,
Mm.
which is kind of end of schooling, because they want them to have a better career, but it all starts so early, like the brain development is so all early, right? So I was very,
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know what? I think I find, I mean, as her mother, I'm quite moved by it. And proud that there's this citizen who is looking to help others. Um, that philanthropic side comes out with the approach because we
yeah.
want to provide that that better education for the children of the future.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And like now to kind of end this podcast, like lastly, because I think you shared so many rich experiences to summarize, is like I ask always is like why arts? Like what is your response to that?
I think because it brings such joy. You know that nothing without joy.
Love that. Yeah, yeah, I love that. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much. Thank you so much. It
Pleasure.
was it was awesome.